Hello and welcome back to Jekyll and Hyde, Annotate with an Examiner. We are now on to the final chapter of Jekyll and Hyde, so chapter 10, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Before we begin, you might want to go and grab your copy of the text, a highlighter, a pen, as well as a notepad so that you can make record of key quotations and use them for revision purposes in the future. You may pause and go and grab everything that you need to and then press play when you're ready. So let's get started. So this title is called Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case. So straight away we've got the introduction of the final chapter, and we've got in this chapter Jekyll's confession letter, and it's the first time we're allowed access to the details of Jekyll's secret double life. Stevenson has kept up the suspense when all along the truth has been hidden and suppressed in Jekyll's secret diary of documents. You can imagine a very different story told by Jekyll instead of Utterson, with this as its beginning. So in chapter 9 we got Lanyon's narrative, and before that the rest of it was all Utterson's narrative. So this is again going to be a very different side to the stories and obviously the full revelation. So let's get started. I was born in the year 18 to a large fortune, endowed beside with excellent parts, inclined by nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men, and thus, as might have been supposed, with every guarantee of an honourable and distinguished future. So Jekyll narrates how he was born into financially comfortable circumstances and progressed through his professional and social life successfully, gaining both the respect and admiration of his peers. So I want you to have a think about, why do you think Stevenson has chosen a privileged protagonist for this novella? And I'd like you to answer this question in the comments below, please, if you can. Remember, I always encourage you guys to be as opinionated as possible, as one of the higher level skills is to be opinionated and critical in your responses, to show that you've really engaged with the text. And this is more for those of you who are aiming for grades 8s and 9s. So if you think about the key themes within the novella and how a character of privilege is perhaps better suited to unravel some of these themes better than a less privileged character might have. And indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. So the things that had long disturbed Jekyll were his secret pleasures, which he struggled to conceal in order to preserve his precious facade of respectability. I want you also to think about what pleasures a respectable man like Jekyll would try to conceal. What sort of pleasures might an upper-class man belonging in a respectable society want to conceal? And I want you to think back at chapter 1 when we met Enfield and he tells us that he met Hyde for the first time. Remember, Enfield was walking the streets at 3 a.m. So, we are, as readers, left wondering what he was doing out at 3 a.m., a respectable man like Enfield. Nobody else seems to question this, but this might be a hint at what sort of pleasures Jekyll might be referring to here. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. So although Jekyll had led a double life, he entered with equal enthusiasm into both light and dark side. Many a man would have been blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. So you might want to write this particular quotation, morbid sense of shame, into the notebook that I encourage you to have as a key quotation. So Jekyll stresses that he's not a hypocrite later on, and we see this stress later on, that he enjoys both lives equally, yet is burdened by feelings of the shame which his secret life brings. Think whether in this instance, Jekyll is a hypocrite. Do you think he's a hypocrite, or do you not think he's a hypocrite from what we've learned so far? It was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation in my faults that made me what I was, and with even a deeper trench than in the majority of men, severed in me those provinces of good and ill, which divide and compound man's dual nature. In this case, I was driven to reflect deeply and inveterately on that hard law of life, which lies at the root of religion, and is one of the most plentiful springs of distress. So he's saying here that that religion is a root to basically misery, which would have been very shocking for the religious audience of the time. But remember, the 19th century was a time when scientific discoveries were rife and people were very intrigued in science. And we see this battle between science and religion within this novel. So think about how that might have affected both audiences, those that were interested in religion and saw science as evil, and those that had begun to become more curious about science, leaving religion perhaps behind. Though so profound a double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me were in dead earnest. So this emphasizes how he enjoyed both sides. He's saying that he was genuine with both sides of him, the dark side, the evil side, as well as the good side of him. They were just as powerful as one another, and he enjoyed the evil side. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame than when I laboured in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering. And it chanced that the direction of my scientific studies, which led wholly towards the mystic and the transcendental, reacted and shed a strong light on this conscious of the perennial war among my members. So mysticism is a kind of philosophy that deals more with religion and superstition than it does with the physical matter of the world. Jekyll's character is a mass of contradictions. His scientific career and his split personality cause a gulf between his professional and private lives, and that's what he means when he's talking about the perennial war. With every day and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to that truth, by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. This is a very iconic quotation from Jekyll and Hyde. You definitely need to make a note of this if you have got a notebook with you that you're collecting quotations in. So we've got the repetition of truly here, which shows how wholeheartedly Jekyll believes that the duality of nature is a condition that affects all men and not just him on his own. So he believes every single person has this double side to them. I say too, because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow. Others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard the guess that man will be ultimately known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens. I, for my part, from the nature of my life, advanced infallibly in one direction, and in one direction only. It was on the moral side, and in my own person, that I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. So he makes the mention of this word primitive, which links to Darwin's theory of evolution that we've mentioned in previous videos. But I am going to mention it in the next video as well, because there's more links to evolution. So we'll have a look at key quotations later on when we delve more into the chapter. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. And from an early date, even before the course of my scientific discoveries had begun to suggest the most naked possibility of such a miracle, I had learned to dwell with pleasure, as a beloved daydream, on the thought of the separation of these elements. So he says that he was both, wholeheartedly both. So he describes it as radically both, so showing how he was equally both good and evil. He was both of his sides, both of these sides equally. If each, I told myself, could be housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. So Jekyll feels that if it were possible to separate both identities, he would be able to enjoy both lives without guilt or shame. This may be proof that Jekyll is indeed a hypocrite, as he is unable to accept his evil side as a natural part of himself. The unjust delivered from the aspirations might go his way, and remorse of his more upright twin, and the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous faggots were thus bound together, that in the agonized womb of consciousness, these polar twins should be continuously struggling. How, then, were they dissociated? So he says it was the curse of mankind, which is an explicit blame on society, and how it is because of the restrictions that upright upper-class society place on individuals that results in people taking part in secret and immoral behaviour. So he's blaming society for this evil side, the fact that he needs to repress his evil side and he needs to let it out somehow. He's blaming society for putting this sort of pressure on him. I was so far in my reflections when, as I have said, a side light began to shine upon the subject from the laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it had ever yet been stated the trembling immateriality, the mist transience of this seemingly so solid body in which we walk attired. Certain agents I found to have the power to shake and to pluck back that fleshly vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. For two good reasons, I will not enter deeply into this scientific branch of my confession. So he gives his reasons why he doesn't go too deeply into it in a moment. But what we realise is that Stevenson chooses not to go into the details of the potion or its anatomical effect too greatly. This may well be because he wants us to take a leap of faith and believe that the transformation is real. It also accentuates the idea of repression that runs throughout the whole narrative. Even in what is supposed to be a confession, Jekyll is vague and secretive, leaving the full sensory experience to the imagination. First, because I have been made to learn that the doom and burden of our life is bound forever on man's shoulders, and when the attempt is made to cast it off, it but returns upon us with more unfamiliar and more awful pressure. Second, because as my narrative will make, alas, too evident, my discoveries were incomplete. Enough, then, that I not only recognise my natural body for the mere aura and effulgence of certain of the powers that made up my spirit, but managed to compound a drug by which these powers should be dethroned from their supremacy, and second, from and countenance substituted, none the less natural to me, because they were the expression and bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul. I hesitated long before I put this theory to the test of practice. I knew well that I risked death, for any drug that so potently controlled and shook the very fortress of identity might by the least scruple of an overdose, or at the least inopportunity in the moment of exhibition, utterly blot out that immaterial tabernacle which I looked to it to change. So he says that he risked death. He knew that he could potentially die by taking part in this experiment, by undertaking it, but it's as if his desire to unravel his evil side was far more stronger than his desire almost to stay alive, you could argue. But the temptation of a discovery so singular and profound at last overcame the suggestions of alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. I purchased at once from a firm of wholesale chemists a large quantity of a particular salt, which I knew from my experience to be the last ingredient required. And late one accursed night, I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when the ebullition had subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion. So I'm just going to stop really briefly here. The next short part that we're going to read could potentially come up in an exam. It's an extract that's never come up before. So it's an extract full of lots of really key quotations and lots of things that show the type of effect Jekyll's earlier experiences of the experiment had on him. So you might want to really pay attention in this section. The most racking pang succeeded, a grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirits that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. Then these agonies began swiftly to subside, and I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. So he says that the initial experience was extremely painful to the point where it was excruciating, but the fact that he keeps going back and doing it over and over again shows how the pain was worth it, the struggles were worth it to unleash this repression this feeling of imprisonment that he had. So he says, I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. So we've got the rule of 3 used here. When Jekyll changes into Hyde, he experiences elation and a sense of freedom. So the list of 3 emphasizes this element of freedom that comes with young age and the lack of responsibility. So it's almost like he could let go of all of the burdensome responsibilities that society had placed on him by becoming Hyde, because he felt younger. And youngness, I guess, is symbolic of freedom and doing whatever you wanted to, and having the freedom of the lack of responsibility. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy. A solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil. So we've got the repetition of wicked here, which increases this sense of freedom. But with this increased sense of freedom, Jekyll's wickedness is increasing too. And the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations. And in the act, I was suddenly aware that I had lost in stature. So he suddenly realizes that he had become smaller, shorter. He felt suddenly smaller. Like physically smaller, I mean. There was no mirror at that date in my room, so he's not got a mirror in his room to check whether he's definitely smaller. That which stands beside me as I write was brought there later on, and for the very purpose of these transformations. The night, however, was far gone into the morning. The morning, black as it was nearly ripe for the conception of the day. The inmates of my house were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber, and I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, to venture in my new shape as far as to my bedroom. I crossed the yard wherein the constellation looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder, the first creature of that sort that their unsleeping vigilance had yet disclosed to them. I stole through the corridors a stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. I must here speak by theory alone, saying not that which I know, but that which I suppose to be most probable. The evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just deposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue, and control, it had been much less exercised and much less exhausted. And hence, as I think, it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. So the theme of secrecy and repression is powerfully at work here. Jekyll longs to come clean and public about his split identity. For him, the transformation into Hyde signifies more than just a miracle of science. It is his chance to be himself, to speak the things that he has always silenced. The act of looking at the mirror, at the manifestation of all his suppressed evil desires, is a momentous symbolic act. And this is very much a grade 8-9 point here. So he is physically smaller and younger because up until now the evil side of his nature had been dominated by the good and therefore much less exercised. So it's important to notice that his good side is more powerful at this stage than his evil side, because later on his evil does take over. Evil, besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on that body an imprint of deformity and decay, and yet, when I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather of a leap of welcome. So he didn't feel disgusted by looking at himself in the mirror. So the purely evil face of Hyde is actually welcomed by Jekyll as preferable to that of his divided personality. So he prefers this disgusting sort of ugly physical side of Hyde than not having Hyde at all. This too was myself. It seemed natural and human. In my eyes, it bore a livelier image of the spirit. It seemed more express and single than the imperfect and divided countenance I had been hitherto accustomed to call mine. And so it's quite ironic that he calls himself when he's Jekyll as imperfect, because actually everything about his physical description is symbolic of a perfect Victorian gentleman. And insofar I was doubtless right. I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none could come near to me at first without a visible misgiving of the flesh. This, as I take it, was because all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde alone, in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. So Jekyll again emphasizes how everyone has a duality of nature, and that's why Hyde is so different and rejected. He's only got one side, so Hyde has only got one side, and it's pure evil. Think about the comments I've made on previous videos about why people have such a strong reaction to Hyde. Could it be because he brings out some home truths, that he forces people to confront their own innate evil? Again, a very much grade 8 or 9 idea there. I lingered but a moment at the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen. If I had lost my identity beyond redemption, I must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine. So he needs to check if he can turn back to Jekyll now, or whether he had lost his previous identity completely. And hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, the stature, and the face of Henry Jekyll. So he realised that he is able to actually turn back to Henry Jekyll. So he's got the best of both worlds. He can turn into Hyde when he feels like it, when he feels like he needs to release his evil side, his dark side, and he can turn back to becoming Jekyll once he's had enough, once he's quenched his thirst. Okay, so that is the end of part 1. Next week, we will be analysing part 2. If you have found these videos beneficial and useful, please remember to like the video, comment on the things and the questions that I've asked you about, and please also remember to subscribe. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.